Good morning. My name is Anupama Roy and I am going to speak today on citizenship and human rights. My lecture is divided into two primary segments. The first of these segments looks at the relationship between citizenship and human rights. The argument that I'll be making in this section is that this relationship can be seen in terms of both harmony and a contradictory cohabitation. The second section of my presentation is based within the larger framework of the argument that changes which are specific to late 20th century have generated forces and social transformations, political and economic changes that have led to a changed relationship between citizenship and human rights. I am going to, in this section, interrogate this argument and look at specifically two kinds of development, particularly the generation of categories such as human rights. So in this section, I'm going to look particularly at the categories of refugees and illegal migrants to argue how nation-state boundaries have indeed been buttressed even in an age of globalization. A second argument that I'm going to make in this presentation in this second section is that there is a particular kind of development which makes citizenship focused on a phenomena called global assemblage of entangled possibilities which are specific to global cities or mega cities as Iva Ong wishes to call them. Let me now begin with definitional concerns. Now in this section of my presentation, I am going to focus on the relationship between citizenship and human rights. I am going to do that by elaborating upon the understanding of citizenship and subsequently the understanding of human rights to show what are the relationships that accrue between these two categories and how they have vacillated between a harmonious relationship and contradictory cohabitation. Let me now begin with the definition of citizenship. Citizenship, as we all know, is about full and equal membership in the political community. How do we know what this political community is? Political community is, in its modern manifestation, largely seen as the nation state. So citizenship is seen in terms of nation state belonging, and nation state is the entity which becomes not just the unit of membership but also the source of identity and also the bundle of rights and entitlements that accrue to those who are considered citizens. Now, the elaboration of the idea of citizenship is important in order to understand how the relationship between citizenship and human rights can be established. Now, citizenship is largely seen in terms of membership, which accrues on everybody who has the status of a citizen. Now, there is nothing like a universal framework within which we can understand what the rights of citizenship are. But as T.H. Marshall would tell us, in societies where citizenship is a developing institution, there's always an ideal of citizenship which is set up as a standard, and all societies try and conform and aspire to this idea of citizenship. Human rights, on the other hand, is seen as rights which are natural, which belong to people because they are human beings. They are considered universal because they would belong to all human persons irrespective of what their national belonging is, what their gender, what their religion, what their caste and their race is, which is why it's considered universal. It's also considered fundamental because it's inalienable and it's necessary for a person to have those rights which cannot be detached from their bodies because it's so fundamental to their being humans. So human rights would be fundamental and human rights would also be essential and human rights would be universal. Now this is where a fundamental contradiction between citizenship and human rights may be seen to arise, because citizenship is a membership that belongs to people and everybody who has the status of a citizen would have rights. So rights based on citizenship are ultimately dependent on a prior status of membership that people have in nation states. The rights of citizenship would therefore seen as emerging from a prior status that people have as members of the political community, which is the nation state. Human rights, on the other hand, transcends national boundaries. It is a right which accrues to people naturally, and it goes beyond nation-state boundaries. Now, if one were to see the historical trajectory of human rights and also see the kind of relationship that existed between citizenship and human rights historically, one can argue that human rights developed in a historical context in the struggle between political authority and individual autonomy. And in the context of this struggle, a negotiated relationship between the rulers and the ruled developed. This negotiated relationship was in terms of the kind of duties that the rulers would have towards the ruled and the duties which the ruled would have towards the rulers. And I call this negotiated because it involved a responsibility on both sides. In the course of times, this negotiated relationship evolved into a reciprocal relationship. This reciprocal relationship involved a duty on the part of the rulers to act in accordance of principles of fairness. It required a duty on the part of the ruled to obey political authority, inasmuch political authority protected their liberties. Now, the basic point about this relationship between the ruler and the ruled was that the ruled gave consent to the rulers and the rulers drew legitimacy based on this consent. In the context of constitutional democracy and constitutional government, the consent was manifest periodically through elections, and consent could be withdrawn if people perceived the government to be authoritarian. And therefore, there was this primary responsibility of the citizens to keep the government in check and ensure that there was limited government which abided or ruled within the frameworks of the Constitution. Now, normally it is the French Revolution. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens in 1789 laid down certain fundamental principles of natural rights. And these natural rights were to accrue to all persons, and they would be fundamental to the way in which people related to the nation and saw themselves as free members of the nation. In the course of time, these principles came to be seen as fundamental to democracy itself and the spread of democracy across the world. Now, it's not just the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen of 1789, but in the course of decolonization processes and the setting up of constitutional democracies in the colonized societies that we see this enormous rupture between political authority of a particular kind and democratic authorities which were set up subsequent to decolonization. Therefore, when we look at the preamble of the Indian Constitution, we can see that it is the people who gave themselves this constitution. It is the people who enacted, adopted, and gave themselves the constitution and also resolved to abide by the principles of the constitution. Now, this preambulatory statement is important because it lays down emphatically the principle of popular sovereignty. Now, popular sovereignty is extremely important for us to understand because it marks the transition from colonization to an independent polity in which the source of political authority is drawn from the people. And in the case of the Indian Constitution, it is also important to see that this was a society which was decolonizing. So this was a society which was breaking free from colonization and aspiring to set up a new polity in which everyone would be equal as citizens. Now, the entrenchment of popular sovereignty was extremely important, and we see in the Indian Constitution itself, there is an article, Article 395 of the Indian Constitution, which repeals the Indian Independence Act of 1947. Now, the repeal of the Indian Independence Act of 1947 is important because the provisions of the act was such that it required that the constitutional text be presented to the British Parliament and the Crown in Parliament for a final ratification. Now, the repeal of the act ensured that the chain of command and the validation of the constitutional text did not go all the way to the Crown in Parliament. It was the people of India who were ratifying the Constitution through the Constituent Assembly. So the Article 395 and the repeal of the Indian Independence Act ensured that popular sovereignty was emphatically inscribed in the Constitution itself, and therefore it made people not just citizens but also the source of authority and the source of the rights that they bore as members of the political community, full, free and equal members of the political community. Now let me make an important argument, which is, when we look at the French Declaration and we look at the Indian Constitution as an example of post-colonial transformative constitutionalism, which we see that both of them mark this important transition from subservience to a particular kind of political authority to a polity in which people would become the source of their rights and political authority itself. Now, why is this important? This is important precisely because with the affirmation of citizenship in a context of bourgeois revolution, which is the French case, and in the context of transformative constitutionalism in a post-colonial society, which is the Indian case, the people in both France and India were able to assert themselves as citizens and therefore also became human persons and people who had natural rights residing in themselves. So human rights and citizenship may be seen in these particular historical contexts as having a harmony. So this harmony is, however, hard to see in other contexts. Even in the constitutions, and the Indian Constitution is an example, an important example, we see that there are rights which are given to people because they are citizens, but there are also rights that are given to people not only because they are citizens but because they are human persons. So we see in all constitutions, particularly the American Constitution and the Indian Constitution, a distinction being made in the fundamental rights chapters or the Bill of Rights chapters between citizens and persons. But it's also important to see that these constitutions also recognize the fact that people would have rights irrespective of whether or not they are citizens or they are aliens. So in the context of India, for example, if one were to see Article 21, we see that Article 21 gives right to life and protection of personal liberties to everybody, irrespective of whether you are a citizen or an alien. So it says this is a right which accrues to all persons. On the other hand, there are rights such as Article 14, Article 15, Article 16 and Article 19, which gives equality, protection before the law, equality of opportunity and freedoms which may accrue only to citizens. Now, why is this distinction between rights of citizens and rights of persons made in the Constitution? I'm talking about the Constitution of India, and in order to see why this distinction was being made, I need to go back to the Constituent Assembly debates. Now, within the Constituent Assembly, there was some justification given to why a distinction needs to be made between the rights which may accrue to citizens only and rights which may be available to everybody, irrespective of whether or not they are citizens, and rights that would be therefore available to all persons. One of the prominent members of the Constituent Assembly, K.T. Shah, suggested or argued in the Constituent Assembly that a distinction is made between rights that accrue to citizens and those that accrue to all persons on certain principles. The right to life, for example, is available to both citizens and strangers because it is a right of humanity in general. But if a person is to enjoy the fullness of life and would therefore require conditions such as health, education, entertainment, leisure, etc., it would require a certain outlay. And this outlay would be made by the government from money that is paid by citizens. So it's the tax money which provides the conditions for enjoyment of fullness of life. So he says that it is therefore desirable that these rights should be given preferably to citizens. Moreover, political rights would be given only to citizens because they demand a certain kind of obligation from the state, which is why a distinction between rights of citizens and rights of persons needs to be made. Now let me come to my second part of the lecture, which has to do with the transformations that have existed in citizenship and its relationship with human rights under conditions which are seen as specifically late 20th century. And these conditions, as I said earlier, have to do with the way in which the economy has globalized. There is also a context in which there is an exchange of technology, flow of information, unbridled flow of information, transformation in all kinds of technology, including digital technology, and there is also a flow of people from one part of the world to another as all kinds of workers and laborers working in different segments of the industry. Now, these developments have prompted people to say that citizenship itself has changed, because citizenship can no longer be seen as confined to particular nation-state boundaries, and rights itself cannot be seen as accruing from nation-state belonging. And we should not be talking about citizenship rights or rights which accrue to people because they're members of particular nation-states, but we should talk of world citizenship, global citizenship, particularly because globalization has presented conditions which are both normative and material for such kinds of normative ideas of world and global citizenship to actually flourish. Now, if one were to see actual developments, it is possible to argue that irrespective of the kind of changes that one says globalization has brought about, there is a simultaneous and strong tendency towards buttressal of nation-state boundaries. And this buttressal and tendency towards buttressal of nation-state boundaries has led to generation of categories such as refugees, illegal migrants, stateless persons, etc. Now, if one were to give an example, the example of the Rohingya Muslims and the exodus from Myanmar to countries all over the world is a relevant example, because it's not just contemporary, but it has become extremely contentious as well. Now, 1 year back, and I'm going to bring in the Indian case now, 1 year back, 40,000 Rohingya Muslims who are identified as residing in India, the government of India said that these are illegal migrants and they need to be expelled from the country. So in response to the government of India's policy to push back the Rohingya Muslims, saying that they were foreign nationals and in most cases illegal migrants, one of the institutions of the Indian government, the National Human Rights Commission, pitched in to say that there is an obligation that the Indian government has, despite the fact that it's not signed any of the conventions on stateless persons or on refugees, to say that the Constitution of India itself put that obligation on the Indian government. The article protecting the right to life of persons is one of the articles that they invoked to say that the Rohingya refugees cannot be pushed back into Myanmar because the Constitution prevents the Indian government from doing so. So the UNHCR said that even if the Indian government was not under obligation under any of the international human rights conventions dealing specifically with the rights of refugees and stateless persons, they have an obligation under what they call a human compassion and attitude towards people who need protection of an authority. And therefore they said that the Indian government should not, under the policy of non-refoulement, send people back, the Rohingya Muslims back into a country where they were at risk to their life and liberty. Let me come to the last part of my presentation. In this part of the presentation, I focus on the phenomena which is generated again by forces of globalization and the way in which market technology and people have come together to produce particular kind of assemblages in spaces which have come to be called megacities. And when I say megacities, I mean cities like Shanghai, city-states like Singapore, where there is a certain kind of input that is given by particular states, nation states in some cases, to make these cities global nodes in accumulation of both capital, human capital, and expatriates coming into the city to give their inputs. So these megacities become important nodes in the entire network of capital accumulation. So these become nodes as sites in which enormous inputs are put in by nation states, and there is an encouragement of people to come and reside in these cities, not as citizens, but as people who would be earning a living, earning enormous amounts of money as expatriates while having their ordinary places of residence elsewhere, maybe in Shanghai, maybe in San Francisco. So people would spend part of the year in San Francisco and part of the year in Shanghai. So cities in this context become zones of graded sovereignty in which there is a large section of people who are seen as indispensable, but they are welcome. Their citizenship is flexible. They become entrepreneurs in negotiating their citizenship within the city-states. They negotiate their terms of belonging. They are not ordinarily and permanently resident in these cities, but their inputs are important for these cities. So there is a distinction between expatriates and ordinary citizens in the city, and the rights that are given to expatriates surpass the rights that belong to the citizens who would be living in relative deprivation and discrimination. So the larger point that I'm making is that in these contexts, the way in which citizenship was earlier seen as a status in which people would have equality and fullness of membership seems to have undergone a mutation which is specific to conditions of globalization. This is the concluding argument which I would therefore wish to give, is we need to see how the contradiction between citizenship and human rights can be harmonized in the way in which it existed at the incipient stages of citizenship itself. How notions of natural rights, notions of rights belonging to persons can be incorporated into the way we imagine citizenship itself. Thank you.